Hello and welcome to another episode of FinTech Focus TV with me, Toby, and today I'm delighted to be joined here in the studio by Rebecca Healey. Rebecca, how are you?
Great to see you again.
Likewise, good to have you back on the show. This time in a slightly different guise. You're going to be talking about your latest report on a subject that's dear to all of our hearts at the moment in AI.
Dear to our hearts. I'm not so sure about it.
It's very interesting to all of our hearts, and at the same sort of stage. It covers every agenda of every conference I go to. It covers pretty much any conversation which we're having at the moment. And the report's a brilliant sort of summarisation of what happens within these markets with AI. So, AI Beyond the Hyperbole. It was sponsored by Plato Partnership.
Yeah.
You put some great stuff together on the report. We're here to talk about some of the findings behind it and talking all things AI in general. So, yeah, before we kick into my big elephant in the room comment that we'll come on to in a second, just give us a quick idea of the précis of what you're talking about and how it came to be in the report itself.
Gosh, so actually it started probably about 18 months ago.
Okay.
And similar to actually writing about ESG before it became more mainstream, there are lots of people talking about it, but people were sort of saying, we don't quite know how this is going to work for us.
Yeah.
And so it was delving into, right, okay, so firstly, what is AI?
Yeah.
And then sort of taking it into conversations with CTOs, heads of data, heads of trading to understand, okay, so this is the potential. How are you actually using it? Are you actually using it? And I think that was the genesis for the report. And it was quite interesting what we actually uncovered. But you're right, I think the big elephant in the room is AI going to take my job?
Yeah.
And I think it was very interesting also at the start of the conversations, 18 months, and then working way through to when I actually started writing the report. You know, there was a lot of fear initially that then, optimism, skepticism, fear, and then reality.
Sort of cycles.
Yeah. And even, you know, I worked with ChatGPT throughout the report because I was sort of questioning, will AI take my job?
Yeah.
So it's been really interesting because it does sort of uncover what AI is capable of and what it's not yet capable of.
Yeah, it's the operative word there as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, very true. But I think for me, I equate it to a 1950s housewife, which is, you know, if the housewife had just been worried about a machine taking over doing the washing, you know, that's not it. You know, it's what it then led to.
Yeah.
And I think that's more interesting in terms of just women taking roles in the workplace, the implications for family life, for workplaces. You know, it completely revolutionized things way beyond the kitchen.
Yeah.
But initially it was X and it went on to be Y. And I think this is what we need to start lifting our heads up a bit and looking at the bigger picture rather than just focusing on, will AI take my specific job today?
Yeah.
It could actually make your job better.
Yeah.
But that's not without its
your
risks.
options as well at the same time, right?
Yeah.
I think for me, that's always been the big thing. When people talk about that sort of protectionism almost about, you know, is my job going to be taken by a machine, by AI or whatever it might be, it's actually how does that sort of come through and what can it look like and how can it augment my thing? And that to me was one of the big things key things that came through, that this is about augmentation and improvement as much as anything else as well, right?
Yeah. And recognizing though that AI is not a silver bullet.
Yeah.
You know, but again, it goes back to, it's a technology tool.
Yeah.
And again, I think sort of part of the process was establishing, what do you mean when you're talking about AI?
Yes.
Do you mean deterministic machine learning, which actually has been around since the 1960s? Or do you mean actually generative AI or artificial general intelligence, which, you know, so there's...
Or a mixture of all of the above.
Exactly, and I think then this is just a process that we're on. And in some senses, that gives people a better level of comfort, because actually machine learning we know about, and that's moved into deep learning, reinforced learning, natural language processing, all things that we work with today.
Yeah.
I think it's identifying what is actually different today from what we've had before. And that's the generative aspect. And the reason why that's so different, it's the combination of three factors. So it's the compute power, and that means you've got way more access to information than you had in the past. Then I think it's the fact that you've got, you can have AI agents, so you can have multiple APIs working on different lines of inquiry at the same time. And the third factor is the fact that you've got text to action in a way that you haven't had in the past. So it really rips up the rule book in terms of workflow practices, because you're not solely dependent on your IT department to run a program for you that you then test, verify, roll out. That sort of workflow process is different. So really it starts raising the questions of what does that actually mean in practice? What people I think are figuring out at the moment are what actually are the use cases. It's quite interesting talking to heads of trading who, the C-suite are obviously very keen on AI being incorporated.
Yeah.
And there is this assumption that it will mean sort of streamlining workflow processes, reducing headcount, et cetera, et cetera. And actually one of the areas that I think people are very focused on at the moment is zooping up TCA. And I don't mean, it's more around actually enhancing the post-trade analysis to make better pre-trade selection. Now, why I think that's an interesting analogy when it comes to the job front is actually what happened when TCA arrived, and you've got a whole new stream of jobs in terms of quant analysts, which are now moving into prompt engineers.
Yeah.
There will be new jobs that arise from this, but they will be very different jobs.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we've got to sort of recognise embracing AI as an opportunity, but recognising its limitations.
Yeah.
So going back to the use cases, I think this is where there's been a lot of adoption in research, and actually talking to a very large global head of research, and he was saying, AI can be amazing for us because we can explore much more lines of inquiry just to establish whether it's an interesting road to go down or not. But ultimately, you still need a human in the loop to say whether this is actually, no, you stop here, this is a complete waste of time in terms of a line of inquiry.
Yeah.
And I think this is moving over into trading it's interesting around the sort of creating or improving SORs and algo wheels. But that's where some of the lines begin to blur, because in the report it was very clear that people were saying we are only using it internally at the moment for exploratory purposes.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens when that ends?
Yeah.
Secondly, it will never be part of direct execution, because I think that was sort of like the comfort line. We're going to cut off here.
Yeah.
But life is never black and white as we would like it to be. So there's these areas of actually, when you are using an algo wheel and 10% of your workflow is below a certain ADV, so therefore it's no touch, it just goes straight through. I think we now need to ask some really key questions of actually what are the processes that we have in place to stop those orders creating a disorderly market. Now, at the moment, we have very clear lines of definition, and the venues and the exchanges and the brokers all have certain risks and controls. But what we now need to start asking is, how does that fit into the bigger picture? Because you only know your section of the order flow. You don't necessarily know the impact on the market. Now, the interconnectedness that we could potentially start to see from greater use of AI means that you do have knock-on effects. And I think this is where it's quite interesting in terms of the change of workflows. So historically, if you go back to the good old days, as it were, a buy-side trader would pick up the phone and they would speak to their relevant sell-side counterpart, sell-side sales trader, in very vertical silos. And that sales trader really held the keys to the kingdom because he had the knowledge. Now, as everything becomes digitalized and moves into the world of data, then it levels up the playing field, but all of a sudden the buy side are sitting and they potentially can get all the access to the knowledge. But then what does that actually mean in practice? So if you get access to the data, which is one thing, and the expense of the data, then you start need to question, okay, is this data accurate? Have I got enough data? Have I got the right data? Have I got the right timeline of data? Do I actually need more peer analysis to make my data relevant to market activity? It's not that any of this is insurmountable, but there are processes that we're going to have to work through, and really understand implications in a way that what will this actually mean? Because frankly, does a buy-side asset manager need a sell-side sales trader in the way that they did in the past? Probably not, but they might need them for much more illiquid trades, harder trades. So again, you're like moving up the service to the next level. And I think that's what's potentially interesting.
We're still utilising the information that comes through from this at the same sort of stage, right?
And you still need your sell-side counterpart. But you need different services from them. And in a different guise than perhaps you did historically. So I think that's what makes it quite interesting.
I think this is a really important part about almost a repatriation of jobs, effectively, and roles and key parts within it. And when people are looking at these sort of things and thinking, right, where is my responsibility within this? How does it change? How do I get to the forefront of all of this sort of movement? That's a critical part of it, and it sort of comes back down to the industry changing before. You spoke before we came on air about the electronifications of the markets and your involvement there in the past as well. There's definite parallels between that sort of play and now as well, isn't there?
Well, I mean, so I was part of Richard Balakis's AES team, which obviously was at the forefront of electronic trading back in the day, so the early 2000s. And actually the analogy was, this is coming. I can remember the day when Richard Balakis came on the trading floor and he said, one day a machine will do your job. And I thought, right, well, I need to learn about the machine then. And that was my role into that environment. But you would have traders actually standing up. As you walked across the trading floor, there were certain traders who'd stand up to try and block your access for fear that, you were going to take their clients' intel.
I can literally physically see it as well.
But, if we look at where we are now, there are very different jobs. I wouldn't say there are less people employed in financial services. There's probably more. So but it is about that transition and being willing to embrace the change. And I think what's different this time around is it's less about, I thought AI really was electronic trading Mark II. Now I think what I'm beginning to understand is that actually AI is about digitalizing the whole investment process. And that means that we're sort of moving from the EMS into the OMS in terms of data and data usage in a way that we haven't before. But it's also about the portability of the data and connecting the data. Kevin Houston, who's co-chair on the Fix AI working group, refers to it as, the reason why Stockholm's a beautiful city is because you have different islands that are all connected up by bridges. And it's that analogy of actually the data only has value. But the data only has value if you can connect it, if you can connect the dots. So this is now why actually as we go into this world of much more multi-asset trading, the connections, the correlations, you need to be able to connect that information to derive value.
And you talk about that in the report with DeFi, and the various different areas and a completely different scene, in terms of the various different asset classes that get involved. It creates quite an exciting future about it all, doesn't it?
But I think it's also interesting in that if you think about it, we've already embarked on it. And I think it's particularly pertinent today. So we're filming on the results of the US election.
Still to be 100% there, isn't it? But we know where it's heading.
Well, this is true. This is true. But I think it's more around the assumption that the Democrats had the sort of control of the traditional media. But that's not actually where people go to for their information now. So, human beings have moved on to the digital, we're doing a podcast of, it's more around how do you get your information now? it's not in the traditional means. So the world has already moved on, and financial services are playing catch up. I think.
Yeah, we've spoken about that a lot on the show in the past. That there's so much about this which is being used in other areas of life at much faster scale, and the traditional regulatory basis of the financial markets has struggled to keep a pace with innovation within technology.
I was actually at UKTI UK Saudi Summit yesterday, and it was fascinating because I lived briefly in the Middle East, but that was sort of back in 2009, and actually seeing where they are today and what is taking place in the kingdom is phenomenal, and so much of that is related to fintech and data and actually embracing the challenges that they obviously face in terms of climate change and sort of moving away from the petrodollar, but really embracing innovation and fintech, which I think could be particularly interesting for our industry as well.
When you see innovation cities being built out there and such, like it's
a very different world.
Running at it completely, isn't it?
Yeah, but that doesn't mean to say that there's still sort of immediate concerns I think that we in the industry have to face.
Yeah.
Number one, first and foremost, is data.
Yeah.
This is going to be, and some of the comments around, data's now a commodity, and it's interesting, isn't it, when you look at Microsoft didn't try and buy Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, they bought LSEG.
Yeah.
And and so it's sort of data is the commodity now that everybody wants.
Well, you're right in the report about it, the fuel and jet engine fuel and all that sort of thing around it.
Absolutely, because good data in means good intel out.
Yeah.
But if you haven't got the right data, then frankly all you have is garbage.
Yes.
But it doesn't just stop at getting hold of the data, as I mentioned. It's actually about the curation of data and knowing where to plug the holes and knowing what to essentially just disregard, because that's not going to give you the information you need. And also, how do you share data? So things like GDPR, anonymizing data. There are a whole host of both challenges but also opportunities as to how you can navigate that particular area. So data is first and foremost. I think it's also acknowledging that there are risks with this. I think it's quite interesting in talking to different market participants about the approaches being taken by firms of some saying, right, no one's using ChatGPT, that needs to be shut down, and even being extending to LinkedIn because you can message, it's just controlling it. Whereas there are others who are saying, right, how can we best use it? But a lot of the responses were based on this is very much exploratory at the moment. So we're keeping it internal. So my question naturally then is what happens when it goes external? So there's a lot going on just in terms of people figuring out what they can do, but it will be on how they can best use that data. And because it will be the speed of insights, but then how can you use that speed of insight to best serve your clients? And I think there's going to be much more bilateral or customization of services, which again is potentially incredibly interesting for how you can better service your clients. And then it's asking what are the systemic risks of this?
Yeah, and there lies the biggest issue. I was thinking as you were talking then about a friend of mine who I get the training with, who's fairly senior at one of the tier 1 banks. And I go back to a conversation we had 10 years ago where he basically wrote off blockchain and decentralized finance and all this sort of thing, and saying it's effectively money laundering, and crypto was where his head sat at. And he's evolved that sort of thinking over time while still being skeptical, I think, of the space. And when we talked, I remember a year or so ago when we were on the platform having a chat, as interesting people like us do around these sort of things, and he was dismissive of AI's real use in capital markets because of its ability to be approximately right, not being good enough. And that to me is where this remains some of the risk. You can see how it evolves over time, but it's as a case of when, not if. But it seems to me that with the regulatory environment that we sit in, there's got to be some real strength and stuff. And you talk there about prohibitive cost and data and good data, bad data. There's a lot still to be smoothed out in this process, as far as
100%. I also think it's that idea of, a human in the loop is still going to be essential for now.
Exactly right. Yeah.
But it's that human oversight in that you are able to do so much more. So, for example, somebody put my report into AI and read it in like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It took me 6 months to write. You read it in 5 minutes. But it's still, actually, if you want the real value, you have to read the report in full because there's a lot there.
Yeah.
And so you can either take the highlighted version.
Yeah.
Or you can take the in-depth version.
Yeah.
And so this is where it becomes sort of almost like human choice
Yeah.
of use AI to actually get you the quickest route to the insight that you want to explore further. And that, I think, is the difference, because it means that you can think about different ways that you can service your clients, find ideas, and then hone in on that to make that a better service. But you're right about, it won't be a silver bullet, but it will enable individuals to do a better job of the service that they actually provide.
Talk to me about that, because I think that's a fascinating thing, and I did read you writing about that, about the ChatGPT version of your report. So it's 5 minutes versus 6 months and all that sort of thing. So when you put those two together, what was your feeling about it, and how close to it was it what you wanted to get out of it?
Well, it was super interesting because I also did it for the T+1 report that I wrote prior.
Yeah.
And actually, when I first keyed it in before I'd done any research, I asked the question, what will T+1 in the US mean for European markets? And it completely missed the point. Yeah. Because it was focused on the information that it had about US markets, whereas we all know that the problem in Europe is actually the discrepancy between funding. Yeah. So actually, the US markets or US funds are in line with the market. Yeah. Well, in Europe, they're not. They could be 4 or 5 days turnaround rather than a 2-day turnaround. So actually, you've got a funding lag that you just don't have in the US.
And this was the interesting part about the being out at the FIX conference in New York and talking to people about that T+1 panel and the rollouts, and then getting Europe ready from it, and the lessons that can go across from each of it is it's not a like for like, is it?
No.
So there's definitely going to be things there that we can learn from the rollout, which was, to all intents and purposes, relatively successful out there. But the crossover will be very interesting about how it comes over here as well, won't it?
And taking it back to the point about AI, AI didn't know that information because it hadn't been fed in. Yeah. So will that change over time as more information gets fed in? Yeah. Probably, could be. But I still go back to... But what other information then comes out ahead of that at the same sort of time as well? Because it's an ever-evolving beast, right? Sometimes you don't know the problem you're looking to solve for until you get everyone in a room and actually you have the discussion and somebody pipes up in the corner and says, well, that might work for you, but what about this? Because it's about uncovering the problem that you hadn't thought of. And I'm not saying that in a, let's find all the issues kind of way, of doom and gloom, but more about it's understanding what the connections mean in terms of an outcome. So while, yes, you could skim read the report in 5 seconds, I couldn't have written the report that I wrote if I hadn't done actually 18 months worth of conversations leading up to 6 months. Because it was, we didn't know what the issues were that we were looking to solve. And I still think, and this is a blatant plug for the FIX working group. So we've got a working group on the AI, as I mentioned, Kevin's the co-chair. But really, we're trying to pull people together to say, okay, what are the issues and what are the challenges? And it also means that we want to work with people who perhaps historically haven't been part of FIX. So a lot of the sort of AI companies that specialize in offering services to financial services, we want to bring them into the fold and say, okay, you haven't been involved in financial services before. What can you do with the data? And really start to question, actually, can we do a better job? How do we need to do a better job?
Well, it's interesting that, isn't it, when you start to see the new faces start to emerge at a few of the conferences, and seeing more and more big tech businesses starting to have stands at things like Trade Tech, where and things like that sort of moving into it, and that creep is a very interesting sort of flow, alluding to what you were talking about before.
Well, it's also it's super interesting because it goes back to what you were saying about your friend on the train and blockchain.
Yeah.
And there was the assumption that data and technology was going to take over. A few years ago, it was all about, Google is taking a stand and, and they're going to dominate.
Yeah.
And then they very quietly retreated and decided to go on a different line of attack. And it's almost like a Trojan horse approach.
Yeah.
Whereas it's not going to be the same as we had before. They're not replicating Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, because actually that's not their USP, nor I think would it serve to eradicate the big global banks. They're just going to offer a different service, and it's going to be more about use of capital rather than actually being involved in the drudge that could be completely electronic. And this, I think, is the reason I keep going back to, actually, it's about digitalising the investment process. It's about moving the electronification away from the EMS into the OMS, but connecting the two in a way that we haven't before.
Yeah.
And across asset classes. And that's when it gets super exciting when you look at things like carbon credits, for example, which is something I'm working on at the moment with ISO, and we've also got a fixed working group looking at that. But it's bringing things into the electronic trading space that weren't there before.
Yeah.
So it's more embracing the legs or the way that we can connect markets that we haven't historically.
Yeah.
And I think, again, going back to your friends, you've got the traditional world and you had the blockchain world. Well, now they're slowly starting to meet in the middle.
Exactly,
and I think that's really where the opportunity lies.
Yeah, and I think we've spoken a lot on this show and done various documentaries about the sort of merge of TradFi and DeFi. And I think the lessons from outside the industry and actually seeing other industry participants come in there and utilise the things, particularly around tech, creates massive opportunities. And we've spoken about the sort of questions still to be answered and the barriers to entry and the various things that can slow things down. But the opportunities and the future of this looks incredibly exciting at the same time as well, right?
And I think it is around education. I go back to the early days on the trading floor back in the early 2000s and just this idea that electronic trading is going to take my job. It didn't, your job changed. So it's more around working together and learning from each other and just collaborating in a way that we have in the past, but I think we can do a better job of it. And it's also not necessarily just collaborating with people in the industry, it's collaborating with people outside of the industry and sort of more in the fintech space. And through that, then educating ourselves about where the opportunities lie. And there was a really good example in the report that was given to me about someone talking about the fact that sort of a senior decision had been taken to just replace everybody with data scientists. And actually that didn't work because the data scientist was only looking at the numbers.
Yeah, it was skill
and
sets,
the numbers,
isn't it?
and the numbers were saying one thing, whereas the head trader was like, that's not going to work.
Intuition plus data, that's where it comes into play, isn't it?
And I think it's this partnership. And at the back of the report, I think I've got sort of like 6 steps. And the last one is blend seniority, experience with technology is really the best step forward.
Well, it goes back to what you said, when that sort of missive was sent out to the trading floor of like your jobs are going to be changing. It's saying, well, I've got to make sure I'm following the tech.
Yeah.
And I think if people start to take that consensus of follow the tech.
But it's not follow the tech blindly.
Yeah. Well, make yourself not follow it, but immerse yourself in the tech, understand the tech, and make yourself the expert into a new world. And those people there who are thinking, right, coming back to the whole the elephant in the room's opening that we had, is those people who can embrace change and upskill in those sort of areas whilst maintaining the knowledge of what's made them good traditionally. That to me is where there's a classic opportunity for people in the space.
Well, it's almost Darwinian, isn't it? The species that survives is the one that adapts. It's definitely. But we've adapted in the past, and we'll adapt again. But it's just making sure that we're educating ourselves as much as we possibly can.
And I love that piece that you talk about collaboration and education, because I 2 years ago, maybe a little bit less, I sat in or moderated a panel talking about restoring trust in digital assets after the SBF fiasco and everything else around that. And if you were to summarise that in 2 words, it was collaboration and education.
Yeah.
And I think that so much of that in this space, and actually if you look at financial services as a whole over the last 20 years, from being very insular and very competitive through to where it is now, and you talk about the working groups that you guys do at Fix and the opportunities of co-sharing on that, that's been a massive evolution that I think has been underplayed about just how people are working together to create better outcomes for it. And probably the sort of at the core of Fix is that those two areas, right?
It's interesting that you say that, because definitely there's a huge role that Fix plays in terms of education from next gen right the way through. But it's super interesting when it comes to AI, because that touches so many different working groups, whether that's equities business practices, fixed income business practices, algo testing, market resilience, and now the new sort of carbon markets. I mean, there's a whole realm of different working groups that we're hoping to actually, from the AI working group, feed into the discussions, but ask those groups that really understand their world of what do you think the implications will be? Because I think it's only when you bring that knowledge and the education and the experience together that you really uncover what are the problems that we need to tackle, and how can we tackle them.
Yeah. Well, Rebecca, look, we've covered a lot in this session. I know that we've spoken before about getting more of these things. This is the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we're talking about and where this can roll. So we've got some more thoroughly interesting. You mentioned carbon beforehand, and there's a whole series of shows, let alone anything else on that subject. Plus, obviously, the evolution of all the things that we're talking about here today. So I thoroughly enjoyed having you on the show. Where can people find the report if they want to go in there and find a little bit more out?
Well, obviously, Plato Partnership have it on their webpage. So, by all means, click on and read and let me know what you think.
Even if you let ChatGPT do it. Lovely to have you on the show. Thanks so much for coming in.
Yeah.
And thank you all for watching. We'll see you soon on the next episode of FinTech Focus TV. Thanks a lot.